Okay, it is 1:25. I'm going to get started with the second module here. In this module, I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into the 4 species that are the focus of the second part of this project. Those species are called SGCNs, and Anne warned us about using acronyms earlier. But SGCN stands for Species of Greatest Conservation Need, and I'll get into that, what that means in just a second here. In fact, it's the next slide. So what is an SGCN? A species of greatest conservation need is an animal that's been identified in what's called the State Wildlife Action Plan. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service works with state agencies all over the United States to develop these state wildlife action plans. And these are plans that individual states put together, that think about the resources and plants and animals and ecosystems in their states. And they go through and they identify priorities for conservation. And sometimes this is priority species, sometimes these are priority habitats. And these state wildlife action plans are updated at least every 10 years. And the idea for them is to develop opportunities for proactive conservation. So how do we work on animals and habitats before they become threatened so that we can, keep healthy ecosystems and keep, having human beings with a healthy place within those ecosystems. And they also provide opportunities to build conservation partnerships like the one in this project. So a collaboration between nonprofits, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and the State Department, the state wildlife agencies. And so these state wildlife action plans often will identify what we call species of greatest conservation need. And these are the animals or plants in a state that are in need of conservation attention. And the needs could be, the attention that's needed could be just survey, like we don't know enough about them. It also could be, we know that they're imperiled and we need to create these specific actions in them. But these animals we're about to talk about have been identified as species of greatest conservation need in Oregon, Washington, and or Idaho. So there's some species that don't cross borders, but most of them are species of greatest conservation need in all of these states. And the 4 species I'm going to introduce you to are these 4 animals. So Morrison's bumblebee, Bombus morrisoni, the western bumblebee, Bombus occidentalis, the Suckley cuckoo bumblebee, Bombus sucklei, and Franklin's bumblebee, Bombus franklini. And I'm going to go through each species individually and talk just a little bit about them. And then after I've introduced you to these 4 species, I'm going to go into what we hope to learn about them and how we plan to accomplish that in the second version of this project. And so first, Bombus morrisoni. I'll first just say that this is an incredibly beautiful animal. I mean, they all are, but this one, there's something about the colors. And this is a photo that I took here, and there's no filter, there's nothing that's been done to this photo. That golden yellow color that you see there is truly something that stands out on this bee. It's different than any other bee I've ever seen anywhere. It's truly beautiful. They're also quite large and just cool to watch when you get an opportunity to do it. Very beautiful animals. We'll talk about how to identify them later. This is just sort of an introduction to their ecology. So in the first iteration of the Bumblebee Atlas project from 2018 to 2020, we detected around 50 of Morrison's bumblebees throughout mostly southeastern Oregon and southern Idaho. We did have a few observations in one location in central Washington, as you see here, and then a very strange observation on the coast of Washington, which we're still trying to figure out. It's definitely that species. The photos were very clear, and they were collected by someone we've communicated with. But we don't know why it's there. There's never been an observation of that species that far west before. And so whether it found itself on a boat or was transferred in a nursery plant or whatever, or maybe there's a population there living in dunes because it was like a dunes environment, and maybe there's a unique population. So this is something we need to investigate moving forward. It's a very cool observation, and something we need to, continue looking at. But this is where we found it. And then all the blue dots is where we found it. The white dots is everywhere where we conducted a survey. So this is where one of our volunteers were out conducting a survey and didn't detect it, right? That doesn't mean that it wasn't there, but it does mean that it wasn't found on that particular day of that survey. So it certainly appears to not be in a lot of places where it probably should be or historically would have been. If you can remember from its sort of historical observations, it would have been found pretty regularly throughout this whole area I'm outlining right now. So historically, it would have been found well up into Washington, in southeastern Washington, and most of Oregon. So, but it's absent from a lot of those places now. Where did we find Morrison's bumblebee? This is very similar to the chart I showed you earlier, which shows sort of the gray on this are all of the surveys that were conducted. And then the blue here are I'm sorry, I'm going to start over because I may have misspoke. The gray bars that you see here are where all surveys for all bees were conducted throughout the Pacific Northwest. And the blue bars are the proportion of observations in those different habitats of Morrison's bumblebee. So you can see that the majority of Morrison's bumblebee observations from the first 3 years of this project were in developed areas. And this is interesting. We don't know if it's actually a real factor, like our urban and suburban areas now very important for this species because our drier areas have gotten drier and they're dependent on areas that are irrigated and that have flowering resources from spring through fall. Or is this a sampling artifact where we just had people looking in Boise and Bend where some of these were detected and that really boosted this developed? So we need to do more work on this one and find out more about where this species is thriving. And if it's truly a city effect or an urban suburban effect, this is something we're going to have to think about, and it will create a unique conservation puzzle to solve. Also found in riparian areas and shrub scrub, sort of more than we would expect just by the number of surveys done throughout the project. So riparian areas are going to be areas we want to look for these animals, as well as out in the shrub scrub drier habitats of southeastern Oregon, southeastern Washington, and southern Idaho. We learned a lot about what plants this species uses in the first iteration of the project. So on the left here, you see a sort of interactive network of plants that Morrison's bumblebee visits. These are the genera that they visited, and sort of the size of these bars represent how important those particular genera seem to be for this species. And then the numbers on the left represent the proportion of visits that were recorded for this species and that plant. So you can see, plants like Sacuragera and Dipsacus all seem to be very important for this species. Because so many of these observations were in developed areas, there's not a whole lot of information here that we can take from a restoration perspective. So like if we were going to create a plant list, we're not going to recommend a bunch of non-native plants to be put out on a landscape, right? We're not going to recommend putting lavandula out into a prairie system or out into the sagebrush steppe. We need to think about what native plants to be using. So we've pulled some of those out, right? There's some sunflowers and lupins and penstemon and thistles and balsam roots and phacelia and ribes all seem to be important plants for this species as well. And so those are the ones we want to focus on, and maybe even think about doing some targeted surveys on plants like that in these ecosystems. So good information here, but certainly more that we also still need to learn about this species. In terms of timing, this is just from the Pacific Northwest Bumblebee Atlas. So the red bars that you see here are sort of our survey window of June 1st through the end of August. And then the observations that came in. So we seem to get, and then the gray sort of dotted background that you see there is the average for all species. And you can see Morrison's bumblebee has a little bit of an interesting distribution here in that we sort of get an early pulse around the end of June, and then a late pulse around the end of August. And whether this is real or just a sampling artifact, because again, there's only around 50 observations here. So a few observations could change this graph fairly dramatically, but it's still interesting to think about. And so as we start to do this, these are the windows, maybe that we start looking for this species. End of June seems to be a good time, and then end of August seems to be another good time. So this sort of makes sense for its habitat as well. End of June is a sort of probably the last gasp of a lot of these drier habitats in terms of flowering resources. And then at the end of August, we get another pulse of rabbit brush and other late season plants that come up in these areas. So those could be reflected here as well. In terms of where did we find this individual? We found it, we found, so there's 70 observations here. The minimum elevation was that one right on the coast of around 2 meters. And then sort of its maximum elevation was around 1,700 meters. And you sort of see a distribution that makes sense given that latitude and elevation have relatively the same effect. So we would find we would expect that at lower latitudes, it would be found at higher elevations. And then the higher latitude we get closer to Seattle, we're finding it at lower elevations. And this makes sense from just a climactic perspective. And a lot of bees that we observed follow this same pattern. And that's what we learned about Morrison's bumblebee in the first iteration, or at least an overview of some of the things we learned about it. The next species is the western bumblebee, Bombus occidentalis. The species was detected pretty regularly throughout a lot of our survey areas, particularly in our higher elevation areas. So along the spines of the Rockies and higher elevation areas, in Northwest Washington mountain ranges, and then along the spine of the Cascades and the Siskiyous. This is where we seem to find this species fairly regularly. It's absent in a lot of our lower elevation agricultural areas, and completely absent aside for these couple of observations, or it's more than a couple actually. There's a lot of observations here on the Olympic Peninsula, but west of the Cascade Sierra Crest, for the most part, it's completely absent, which is not true historically. It was found in these areas. So want to continue looking in those areas and seeing if we can detect it. And then, figuring out, is it really absent from these drier, lower elevation areas where we used to find it? Same graph as we looked at for Morrison's bumblebee. There's also a lot of developed observations for the western bumblebee, but we're also seeing a lot in grasslands and meadows, and then a fair number in woodlands and forests. So interesting for this species, different places to look at. But one of the nice things about this species is we do have enough observations in sort of non-developed areas to begin to think about putting together a plant list for restoration. And so here's the same network of plant observations on the western bumblebee as we had with Morrison's bumblebee. You can see there's a fair number more plants. And then, some of these percentages over here start to be meaningful. There's a fair number of sort of non-native species, but there are some native species as well. So thistles appeared to be very important for the western bumblebee. Spirea is another important plant at 12 and 10%. And then lupins, fireweed, snowberry, horse mint or giant hyssop. And then goldenrod is another one that appears to be important here. And one of the cool things here is we start thinking about sort of restoration in these areas. There's not a ton of overlap in locations between Morrison's bumblebee and the western bumblebee, but there are some. And so to sort of think about that, we built this interactive floral network where we can look at species that the western bumblebee visited. Let me get out my pointer here. I know, I can't have my pointer at the same time. Hopefully you can see my cursor here. So I can hover over sort of occidentalis and it will highlight those plants. And I can hover over Morrisoni and it can highlight those plants. But then I can also hover over the plants and find out which one of them we're benefiting both species. So we can see on lavandula or lavender that was important for both. Lupin is another one that had a lot of observations for the western bumblebee and Morrison's bumblebee. And so we can use these floral networks to start thinking about which of these plants are going to benefit both of those species, and that we might put into some restoration effort in those areas. We also built the same phenology. Sorry, everybody, my screen is not advancing for some reason right now. Let me just see if I need to close that, maybe. Oh, yep, that worked. We advanced too far. Okay, here we go. So then we wanted to look at the phenology, like when is a good time to look for the western bumblebee. And this one comes from closer to 400 observations. So we have we're a little more confident in this. So again, the red is the barriers of the survey window. The gray sort of dotted background are all species. And then the blue is the western bumblebee. And you can see this species seems to trend later than a lot of others. So we're getting our peak sort of around the end of July. So good time to go look for this species. There's some reasoning behind this that we would think is that we're also finding this species at higher elevations, and you'll see in that chart in a minute. And so not a huge surprise that we're finding it later in the season if we're also detecting it at higher elevations, right? That makes sense naturally because those areas are under snow still in June, at least in some years. So yeah, then when we take this peek at the elevation gradient, you see we're finding this species at much higher elevations than we were Morrison's bumblebee. So, we're finding it all the way up to nearly 3,000 meters. And the lowest observation that we had was 15 meters here, up near these are on the Olympic Peninsula, these lower elevation ones here. So that's the western bumblebee. Next species is Franklin's bumblebee. Franklin's bumblebee historically had one of the smallest distributions of any species in the world. And so it was only found basically from Roseburg, Oregon, down to about Mount Shasta. So the pretty narrow window, around 120 miles long and around 30 miles wide, really just in the Siskiyous down there. And again, this species has been proposed endangered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And this next slide here has a little mix of information on it. The species is very similar to the western bumblebee in terms of its biology and in terms of the way it looks. So I've included some of the plants over here that may also matter for Franklin's bumblebee. But when we look at the historic observations of this species, these are the plants that seem to be important when we look at the older records. This species has not been detected since 2006. It's possible that it's actually extinct, although this species inhabits a very remote and very wild part of the Pacific Northwest. And a lot of these more remote areas have not been visited and have not been surveyed. And so getting out into those areas and looking at some of these key plants is really important. So again, thistles, spirea, lupin, fireweed, snowberry, giant hyssop or horsemint, and goldenrod. A lot of the same plants that we find the western bumblebee on seem to be important for this species. The phenology of this species, this is from Bumblebees of North America book that was co-written by Leif Richardson here on the webinar. He shared this figure with me to share with you. So again, there's only about 250 observations, or fewer than 250 observations of this species ever. Very rare. And so one of the things to think about here is when to look for it. Probably depends on elevation and a number of different things. Last species that I'm going to introduce you to is Bombus sucklei. Bombus sucklei is a cuckoo bumblebee. It's one of those bumblebees that sort of fit into that unique life cycle that I was talking about in module 1 there, where it invades the nests of other species and has to do so delicately. Interestingly, this species seems to have a relationship with the Western bumblebee. It's the only species in the West that it's ever been found reproducing in. So it's believed that it's sort of an obligate host. And so the Suckley's cuckoo bumblebee is dependent on the Western bumblebee. And so the fact of the matter that the Western bumblebee is in decline would lead us to believe that that its parasite would also be in decline, or maybe even in more decline. So not a huge surprise there. We have not detected this species in the first iteration of the Pacific Northwest Bumblebee Atlas project, but these are the historic observations. And you'll notice if you sort of look at this map and then go back and look at the map of the Western bumblebee, which I'll pull up next, there's a lot of overlap. So not a huge surprise here if these two species are related to each other, if we see that they're found basically in the same locations. So we're finding, historically at least, sucklei in the same places that we found the Western bumblebee. When to look for this species? It seems to be that we find most females sort of in mid-June or late May or early June, which makes sense. It would be out sort of while queens are searching, so earlier than some other species. And then there's another late pulse in August, when males come out and can be quite abundant, at least when the species used to be at higher densities on our landscape, could be more abundant. When we sort of pull out the male-female distribution and just think about when are we going to try to detect this species, it looks like early August is really the key window to get out and conduct surveys for this. The one caveat is just that males are harder to ID from photos than females. They're not impossible. We just need to do a good job of taking photos during that time of year if we're gonna detect it. And another interesting thing to think about here, and one of the things that we're thinking about moving forward with this project, is because of this relationship between the Western bumblebee and the Suckley cuckoo bumblebee, is thinking about using observations and timing of the Western bumblebee to detect the Suckley cuckoo bumblebee. So if we go to Western bumblebee sightings and come a month later, that seems to be a good time to look for Suckley cuckoo bumblebee, as long as that first observation was a queen, right? The queen occidentalis. So sometime between sort of 3 to 5 weeks later seems to be the peak. And so we're going to try to begin to use those observations of the Western bumblebee as a guide to help us look for the Suckley cuckoo bumblebee, or at least when and where to do that. Historically, the Suckley cuckoo bumblebee was found on these 4 species, seem to be important. So asters, rabbitbrush, thistles, and goldenrod. So again, just thinking about the Western bumblebee and those observations to try to find Bombus sucklei. So this is a map that shows the sucklei observations are in red or in purple are the historic sucklei observations, and then in white are the historic occidentalis observations. And so we're going to continue, as I've said, to use occidentalis sightings to help guide us to try to find this species. And so in summary, over the first 3 years of this project, we've learned a lot about these 4 species. We've learned more about their biology. We learned more about 2 of these species, I guess. We learned more about their biology, the plants they're using, the habitats they're found in. But we still have important information gaps. And our goal now is to close those information gaps. And to do that, one of the things we need to do is find Franklin's and Suckley's cuckoo bumblebee. We need to go out, increase search efforts, and try to detect those species so that we can institute on-the-ground conservation efforts. We also need to learn more about Morrison's bumblebee in natural settings, and then focus on also learning more about nesting and overwintering biologies. So how do we learn more about where these species are nesting and overwintering? And how do we use that information to better guide management and conservation efforts? So those are really our goals for the next 3 years of this project, is how do we fill these information gaps? And it's important to also say at this point that we also want to continue this essential long-term monitoring project that we've begun. So we're not just trying to find these 4 species. We're also still interested in these other surveys throughout the region to continue long-term monitoring so we can keep a pulse on these populations and see how they're doing through time. So it's not just these 3 species or 4 species that we're focusing on, but they are a key component to the next 3 years of this project. And so with that in mind, our next steps are to think about how do we do this on the ground. We've got a team of folks that we've signed up. We've got more people that are trying to join this team. How do we mobilize them in order to help us better? And to do this, we've sort of divided the project up into 3 parts. And the first part is the one where we need your help. These are what we're calling high potential zones. And I'm going to go through the development of those high potential zones and what they mean and how they can direct you to help us over the next 3 years. There's also 2 other things going on. These are more sort of Xerces and the Departments of Fish and Wildlife and Fish and Game that are working on these. But I'm just going to briefly walk you through those projects as well. And one of them is a targeted sort of west-wide searches for the Western bumblebee. And then we're going to do some life history studies for the Western bumblebee as well. And I'll just touch on those briefly so that you know they're happening. But it's not a project that we're asking you to get involved with at this point. So first, jumping into high potential zones. So we've said that we need to learn more about Morrison's bumblebee in natural areas, and we need to learn more about the Suckling cuckoo bumblebee using observations of the Western bumblebee as a guide. So what we did is we took all those observations of the Western bumblebee and Morrison's bumblebee, and on top of it, we placed the historic observations of all 4 of these species. So we now have, in sort of white and yellow, you see the observations of Morrison's and Western bumblebee, and then these historic observations of the 4 species of conservation concern. And then what we did is we put all of those observations on a map of the Pacific Northwest by habitat type. And what I did is I built a little model, I guess, which considered how difficult or easy it is for a bumblebee to move through particular habitats. And what you see here is the result of that model. The redder areas are the areas, or the darker red areas are the areas that it's more difficult for a bumblebee to travel through. And the reasoning could differ. Like agricultural areas can be difficult for a bumblebee to move through. A lava flow would be a difficult area for a bumblebee to move through. A city would be a difficult area for a bumblebee to move through. An alpine area would be a difficult area for a bumblebee to move through. But a grassland or a shrubland, they're pretty easy for a bumblebee to move through. And so they could easily disperse sort of within a grassland up to their sort of maximum distribution distance, which we believe is around 10 kilometers. And so after sort of building this model of cost for bumblebees to move through, we basically put a point at each of these historic observations and said, okay, let's see how far or what's the high probability area from those points that a bumblebee would have traveled in these various landscapes. And from that, we have the development of these high potential zones. And so you can see surrounding all of the historic points in the Pacific Northwest here are these high potential zones where we basically have a 10-kilometer polygon around it that's affected by the landscape and what in which it's in. And what I mean is sort of if we zoom in deeper than that, you can see this is just outside of Boise, Idaho. You can see that in more natural areas to the northwest of the city, it's pretty clear that a bumblebee could likely travel in 360-degree directions. The closer we get to town, the harder it is for a bumblebee to move through that. And so our high potential zone gets small very quickly. We get to these cooler, lower potential zones very quickly. And so these different habitat types create these different shapes, which are then developed into what we're calling high potential zones. And if you look at our map, those high potential zones are reflected throughout our 3-state region. So we still have divided the states up into equal area grid cells. They're the same grid cells that they were the first time around. And those grid cells are still the focus for adoption, right? So when you go to our website to try to get involved, we are still asking you to adopt a grid cell, which is to take one of these 50-kilometer by 50-kilometer grid cells and say, I'm going to do my surveys within that grid cell. All we've done is we've now added these high potential zones on top of those grid cells. So let's say you choose to adopt a grid cell. What we're then going to ask you to do is to try to focus your survey effort inside one of those blue polygons. You don't have to do this. You don't have to do this. You could, if your grid cell doesn't have any blue in it, that's okay. You don't have to, you can still do surveys, and we still want to do that long-term monitoring. And you might turn up new observations of these species, which is great too. But we're really trying to focus in these blue areas so that we can find Morrison's, Western, the Suckley cuckoo, and Franklin's bumblebee. And you'll notice that these blue polygons, I'm not telling you which species that these high potential zones are based on. They're just universal. All these species are equal. And part of this is we don't want to bias the search effort. We don't want you to be out there looking for a particular species. We want you to out there doing the same surveys that you've always done for all species, so that we can continue to get these equal area efforts, so we can compare past and future condition too. So basically, if I was to tell you exactly what I wanted you to do, if you were an open book and you just said, Rich, tell me what you want me to do, I would say, you'll notice that there's 2 different colors of grid cells on this map. There are dark green grid cells and there are light green or yellow grid cells. Those dark green grid cells are the areas that weren't surveyed in the first part of the Atlas project. And so those are our highest priority areas. And so if you were to be an open book and say, what do you want me to do? I would say adopt one of those dark green grid cells and then conduct both of your surveys within a blue polygon within that dark green grid cell. That would be sort of the ultimate best contribution. You get a gold star. That doesn't mean that other contributions elsewhere aren't more than welcome. Of course, any survey and any of these grid cells that we have contributes to our project in one way or another. But from a sort of top priority way, like dark green and blue polygon is the best. But other opportunities to contribute as well. As in the past, we've had sort of multiple levels for you to contribute and add to this project, and nothing is different this year. We're just trying to focus some of these efforts for these 4 species. And that's really sort of the new focus of the project right there, the new grid cell map and all of that. That's why it looks the way that it does for those of you that are coming back to the project, and thank you. And for those of you who are brand new, just know this is how we sort of target search areas for this project. Is each year we develop a new map which has new priorities, and we try to direct our search effort towards these priorities. And this is what it looks like for 2021. In addition to this project, which is sort of the main focus, is that effort I was just talking about, the high potential zones. The Xerces Society and Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife and Idaho Department of Fish and Game and Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife have all partnered together to do this west-wide search for the western bumblebee. So there was a paper that came out a couple of years ago that identified all these areas throughout the western United States that had been insufficiently surveyed for the western bumblebee. And so we've targeted some of these areas. We're going to go out and do surveys. And they're pretty similar actually to the Pacific Northwest Bumblebee Atlas, but we're not at this time asking volunteers to contribute to this effort. This is something that the Xerces Society is doing. But if you're in the audience and you work for the BLM or the Forest Service or a state agency, and you might be interested in contributing to this effort, please reach out to Anne or Joel or myself, And we were trying to help coordinate and facilitate this effort throughout the West. And then finally, the Xerces Society and well, all the partners of the project are also starting next year going to be working on targeted life history studies. So what we're going to do is we're going to take high concentration observations of the Western bumblebee, and we're going to return to those places weekly or maybe even daily and do repeated searches to try to find nests. And then we're going to stay there through a lot of the fall. And we're going to try to find places where queens begin to dig their hibernacula and overwinter. So we're hoping to use some of these longer term observation areas so that we can learn more about what habitat types are important for nesting and overwintering. And we'll learn a whole lot more about nest phenology as well, like rates of animals flying in and out of nests, assuming we're able to detect some. So again, these last two things I just mentioned are not efforts that we're specifically asking you to get involved in. They're just part of the project, and I thought some of you might find it interesting, and so I'm sharing them with you. And if you'd like to learn more about it, feel free to reach out to myself or Joel or Anne or Leaf, and we'd be happy to share some more information with you. With that, I'm done with this section, and that's the end of module 2. What we're going to do, well, I guess I'll break now and just see if there's any pertinent questions that need to come up here. Are there any questions out there?
Rich, there was one question. I know we're going to talk about photography a little bit later, but when it comes to photographing male sucklei, there was a question about what exactly would we want to focus on?
Yeah, I'll touch on that later.
Okay.
I'll touch on that later when we talk about specifically photos for that species. Yeah.
Hey, Rich, there's a little bit of a question about, you said if you want to get a gold star, go to adopt a bright green grid cell and then go to the blue area within. What about a blue area only that's not within that's in like that lighter green grid cell, or a bright green grid cell that doesn't have a blue, i.e. high potential area?
Those would be silver stars, not gold stars. No, those are great targets for surveys as well. So basically anywhere within a blue zone is a high priority area that we really want to focus surveys on. The reason that I called out the dark green ones, or what you called bright green, for surveys is just we have no information over there from the last 3 years. And so getting surveys in those areas is high priority. But then also within those blue areas is just the most priority. But so yeah, thank you for calling that out. It's really, but surveys anywhere are gold stars. These are just platinum stars, I guess. So, but yeah, I hope that clarifies some.
Yes, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any more pertinent questions out there? I'm going to take the crickets as a no. And we will just take a brief break here. Let's take 7 minutes, if everyone would, to take a personal break here, get some food, get some calories, walk around a little bit, do some stretching. And we will start back up at 2:10 Pacific time. 2:10 Pacific time. Be back. Thank you.